All right, I think on that note, I will get going here. Welcome everyone today to my talk on using bioelectrode sensors to empower machine learning models for the optimization of aeration and biological nutrient removal. I'm Dr. Colin Regich, and I'm the Technical Development Lead at Sentry. And today, if you have questions, please feel free to write them on the chat, or else hold them. There'll be an opportunity at the end of the talk today to ask questions. Before I go any farther, I'd like to give a quick shout out to Aryan, who's a PhD candidate at University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, and Dr. Ro Kusik, his supervisor. They've been instrumental in getting us started on data-driven modeling using our bioelectrode.
And I believe Aryan is on the call also. Hey, Aryan.
Hey.
Yeah, so he can help me answer all the tough questions that I don't have answers to.
Yeah. Good morning.
So the goal of today is really, I would like to make the case for bioelectrode data in wastewater treatment facilities. I'm going to make this case really using comparison of variable importance. So try to demonstrate how important bioelectrode data is relative to other data, and also show some results from data-driven models. Along the way, there's a number of questions I look to answer. These questions are: what is a bioelectrode? What does the data look like? How can we utilize the data to create predictions? What is a data-driven model and how is it created? And finally, how can we measure a variable's importance when it's not nonlinear? And this will introduce concepts of mutual information, Shapley, and manual feature selection. So here's a diagram of a bioelectrode. It's two electrodes, so an anode and a cathode. On the anode, we grow biofilm of biology. Usually they're proteobacteria. These bacteria are able to consume simple organic carbons, and when they do so, they respire onto the electrode. When they respire, this creates a circuit and a flow of electrons, and we can measure this flow of electrons. This gives us a signal that tells us kind of what their carbon consumption rate is, so how fast they're eating these carbon molecules, as well as an idea of microbial health. This creates relatively big data. We get a sample every minute from our sensors, and we find that that sample is accurate to a minute. And this is typically what you see in a signal. So you'll see diurnal patterns as the activity changes between night and day, which is typical with changes of wastewater characteristics, or else just natural processes changes between day and night. What we also will pick up is peaks and troughs. Quite often the peaks are high organic overloading events. We see peaks because our biology is eating more carbon, and we see troughs because usually there's some form of upset. So some sort of contaminant or chemical has come in that is disrupting the metabolic activity. And it's great to be able to see this and pick up events, but there's so much more that can be done with this data. The natural thing to do with the data is do some form of traditional modeling. So ideally, we're trying to understand what is happening in our process. So we have some features or variables that we're putting into a model, and we're predicting some sort of results so that we can control. Traditional models are quite often mechanistic or empirical. Now, the challenge is they take a lot of data, or else potentially they're very, very complicated and really specialized quite often to an individual plant. So when we're looking at real-time control, the mechanistic and empirical models tend to break down because we don't have the data to feed to them, or else we don't know the mechanistics well enough. The option to get around this that's really being developed is data-driven modeling. So this is really machine learning. So the concept isn't really that tough. What you think is you have a whole ton of historical data, hopefully good quality data. So this creates your features or the variables you're going to feed in, and then your targets. So that's what you're trying to predict on the way out. So it could be nitrate removal, it could be required aeration. So you feed all this data into the algorithm, and you get out a model of a relationship. And this model is very complex in some ways and very simple in other ways. But really, biological processes are by nature very complex and dynamic. It's going to be hard to model mechanistically or empirically. So really, this is the solution we have to begin to improve our processes in wastewater treatment plants for real-time operation. And really, the hope is that from the hope is that you've created these mathematical models that are stable in time, or stable enough and maybe need updating in time, where you can put features in. So that's put the data you have through your process data and get out some form of result that allows you to better control something like aeration or methanol addition. Now, there's a lot of processing with data and driven modeling. There's a lot of data cleaning and verification. Because you're basing your whole creation of a model on your data that you historically have. If you're feeding a garbage, bad data, poorly cleaned, poorly calibrated sensors, you're going to get terrible results out. They're just not going to reflect what actually happens. And there's a lot of work that goes into data-driven models. And sometimes there's a lot of different streams of data, so a lot of different features or variables. And it makes sense how you select the ones that are relevant and ignore the ones that aren't relevant, because again, it's time consuming and costly to maintain the data flows in terms of cost of maintaining a sensor that might not be useful, or alternatively, it's one more thing that could cause problems in your data if the sensor isn't properly maintained. So we're using a bunch of different algorithms, and probably you've heard of all these. There are multiple linear regression, random forest, XGBoost, and neural networks. Quite often we found that multiple linear regression does not work well for any of the operations we're trying to model in wastewater treatment plants, because our relationships just are too nonlinear to be captured by a model like this. I'll talk a little bit about random forest and XGBoost, and I won't talk about neural networks too much today at all. Actually, not at all. I just wanted to present briefly what random forest and XGBoost do, because a lot of people get scared when they hear of machine learning. And I want to kind of demonstrate that, yes, there's a lot of complexity that's being formed, but the general concept isn't really that hard to swallow. So random forest and XGBoost are both ensemble techniques, and they really are following the power in numbers. And what they're doing is making a whole bunch of these trees. And this is an example of one of them for dissolved oxygen in a system. And it's a whole series of yes, no decisions till it gets down to the leaf node. And the leaf node is what, in this case, predicts for the dissolved oxygen. So it's just asking if the condition is greater than or less than this, then that decision all the way down to making some form of prediction. Now, we don't just make one tree like that. We make hundreds or even thousands of these trees and have them all go through a decision by feeding in the features. So that you feed in the data and it goes and it goes down through the tree and comes out with some expectation that it will then average between the trees. So it allows for a lot of dynamic and nonlinear relationships to occur, but really the concept isn't too overly hard. Now, I briefly want to introduce the Barton-Faux 5-stage process. I want to introduce this because when I went through assessing variable importance, I was doing it mostly on a Barton-Faux 5-stage process. And that's what I'll demonstrate today. In this process, they have 2 Sentry probes, which are on the influent. They're basically at the same location effectively. They have 3 nitrate probes throughout the process, at the end of a NOx tank, at the end of the aerobic tank, and at the end of the process just before the secondary clarifier. And then they have an ammonia probe in the aerobic tank. One thing to notice is that they actually have 3 trains with probes in them. So they actually have 12 of all the ammonia and nitrate sensors together. So that's a lot of sensors, which will become important when we start to discuss the value of them going forward. So in the Barton-Faux process, we're seeing a nitrified recycle. So that's recycling the nitrate back to the NOx tank, where it's trying to combine denitrification by combining with the carbon there. And we also see the intended EBPR process in the anaerobic, where you're trying to enhance uptake of phosphorus in the later aerobic process by selecting for the POW community. This slide has a lot to swallow. So this is the first way that I assessed variable importance, and it's called mutual information. It's kind of the analogous one or comparable to Pearson being linear, so it's mutual information is kind of the Pearson of nonlinear systems. And really, it's just a measure of how much knowing one variable reduces the uncertainty of knowing the other. So it's also symmetric. So XY is the same as YX for mutual information. The important thing as we go through here is that just recognizing that the higher the mutual information, the more likely that that parameter has some ability to predict the other as they share some information. So I went through for this Barnfo 5 process, and I looked at all the different parameters and how they compared, or what sort of mutual information score, I should say, they had with the Sentry signal. So the first litmus test here is we have two Sentry sensors. So there's Sentry signal 2 against Sentry signal 1, and it's very, very high, which makes sense. These sensors are essentially effectively in the same place. So they're giving essentially the same information, which is good to know, because knowing this can also help us figure out how many sensors a system should really have. But getting on to what processes it helps us understand, the first one is aeration. So tank 4 aerobic zone 2 is near the end of the plant, and we see quite a high mutual information, and anything I find over 0.5 is a pretty good relationship. So we should be able to use our sensor to help us predict and project dissolved oxygen, which allows us to understand aeration. The second one is nitrate. So in this plant, they have, this is a measure of effluent nitrate, which is quite strong mutual information with the sensor. And even the return flow, which is returning the nitrate to the process, has strong information. So that suggests we should have some ability to help optimize nitrate processes. And as part of this, they're using methanol to add organic carbon at certain points when they need it to remove nitrate. And we find that methanol has has mutual information with our sensor. So throughout this, I really think there's the opportunity to help with nitrate removal in processes, especially where we have adequate data. And finally, the other process that is of interest for nutrients is orthophosphate. And there's pretty good mutual information still for the reaction channel orthophosphate. So that's the effluent orthophosphate and the average orthophosphate coming out of the aerobic process. So I can see the opportunity of trying to help regulate what the plant is doing to remove orthophosphate through this process. As I said, for mutual information, XY is the same as YX. So I wanted to flip it around and further strengthen my case of why bio-electrode data such as Sentry data is so useful. So the first one here is orthophosphate. So all these parameters looking at the mutual information they have with orthophosphate. And we find that Sentry signal was the strongest parameter we have, or feature, I should say, for mutual information. Similarly, it happens with nitrate again. Sentry signals the strongest other than the measure of nitrate concentration itself after the second stage. So that also is a good litmus test because you would expect the nitrate concentration to be there. So this is a good sign that our test is working, and it's very encouraging that Sentry signal is so strong in helping us understand these two nutrient removal processes. Final is aeration. More specifically, this is looking at dissolved oxygen in the last stage. And we find that Sentry signal is the most important, even interestingly, more important than some of the aeration in the different stages of this process. So this really tells us that these biological signals are very strong and very meaningful for understanding what's going on throughout a complex process such as Barnfo 5. The second method is Shapley values. So the way to read the Shapley value is, you can imagine at 0, that's the average, in this case, average DO of the samples. -1 is samples that are 1 lower than the average, 1 above is 1 higher than the average. And when we're reading this, it's ranking the importance of the variables from top to bottom. And so Sentry is the most important one. It's also the broadest. And a good litmus test too is we know Sentry is going to be related to the amount of organic carbon coming in. So the higher, so the more red it is, the lower the Shapley value. And so we see that as the case. And aeration is the opposite. The higher the aeration, the lower the higher the aeration, the higher the SHAP value, because more aeration means more dissolved oxygen. So it's a second way that Century has really shown its strength. Now, the next way we can look at it is we can start to consider the parameters that we include in the model and determine who we should remove, or who we can remove without really impacting our model. So the first thing to take in is complete model at the top has an R-squared of 0.95, which is the ideal being a 1, and this is for validation data, and an RMSE of 0.19. So quite strong. The second one below is what happens when you take sensor data out. So that's taking Century signal out, nitrate out, and ammonia out. And you see that it falls quite a bit. So that does suggest that there is merit for adding some form of sensor data to our process. So what I wanted to do is compare what happens if I have Century, a Century signal in the bottom, versus what happens if I have all the other sensors. So that's the other 12 sensors they have in process. And what I find is that the two are quite comparable. And this is meaningful because it suggests that we could choose either one and probably get a reasonably the same model out and the same results. And that's really, in this case, one Century sensor versus 12 probes. So from an assessment of the value of bioelectrode data, if you're trying to model one of these processes, you're looking at $13,000 a year for 2 probes of Century. So probably even more. There's still ability to get more insight and data out by having 2 probes versus 120,000 annum for 12 probes. So that's estimating, the capital cost and the maintenance cost and everything else at about $10,000 a year for a probe. Now, getting into some of the modeling results, this was one system, not the Barnfo 5. It has 2 Century signal sensors. After the primary clarifier in the aerated sludge process, I was utilizing MLSS, airflow, and weekly soft sensors and daily soft sensors. And the goal here was using about 3 months of data. How well could I predict at the end, predict in this in the third stage of the process, the dissolved oxygen. And you can see that we can do quite a good job here. This isn't an optimized model, but we still have an RMSE of 0.84 milligrams per liter, and R-squared of 0.67, which is getting probably close enough to the point where you can consider using it in control to manage the aeration. This is an interesting analysis of how we can improve aeration for this facility. So in this case, it's the last stage of the process. Their goal is to keep the aeration above 1 milligram per liter, but I'll keep it as close to the 1 milligram per liter as possible. So in this case, constraining it between 1 and 1.25 milligrams per liter. Obviously, anything below the 1 is kind of concerning because they're worried about incompliance or problems because they don't have enough dissolved oxygen to remove all the organic carbon or other substances. And anything above 1.25 is really over aeration. So there's an opportunity for cost savings. So this is what the aeration looked before at the start of this study, and I'll show you what we project or suggest the aeration should be by modeling it. And it's pretty peaky, pretty high variance for being at the end of a process. So I ran a model, and the model was, again, about 2.5 months of data, and it was used to predict the next 2 weeks of data. And we find that our model is able to greatly improve on the dissolved oxygen. So we're not seeing nearly the peaks above 1.25, only hitting above 1.5 twice. And we're seeing that those big drops that sometimes are concerning because they're pretty much getting into the anaerobic or condition, or I guess anoxic condition, aren't nearly as severe. So this is what we project you would need in the new aeration that was seen to improve the dissolved oxygen. And when you run the numbers, you're we're estimated the opportunity is to save 21% on aeration based on just the airflow. And we don't see nearly the drops that we saw, which is also a good sign. Now, models are great for just predicting and obviously for process optimization. If you can make a good model, you can run the plant better. The other thing they're useful, though, they're really useful is understanding when processes are changing or problems are happening. Because if you can create a good model that you trust, then when your model doesn't follow the expectations for measurements, or those two aren't close, then you know that something has gone off. So in this case, in the red box, what actually happened was an ammonia and nitrate breakthrough. When you look at what our model is saying, is our model really begins to disagree about midday of the 27th, and it was about another day before you had actual problems come through in the measurements. So this really suggests to me that, and highlights that models are more than just simply predictors. They're also great for understanding our processes and for seeing when process upset happens. And hopefully you can get out there a little bit sooner, collect the samples and determine the cause to both protect the process, but also to learn so that problems don't happen again. So in summary, bioelectrochemical data holds a lot of information. It's got crucial information for creating data-driven models in the wastewater space. In modeling a system, you're really doing two things that are both useful. You're creating predictions, which is creating opportunities for optimization of a process. And then you're also enabling earlier detection, because if you have models that you trust, then when process changes or upsets, you can see it quicker because the model will disagree potentially before you see upset in the measurement parameters.